The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
I'm so happy to be with everybody here again today. We are so lucky because I have Dr. Jonice Webb joining us, and she has written two really remarkable books. One is called Running on Empty, How to Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect. And I'm just going to read the jacket because it says, a terrific book about what you didn't get in childhood, guidance, attunement, in some cases love, the damage caused by emotional neglect, and what to do to heal. And the other one is called Running on Empty No More, Transform Your Relationships with Your Partner, Your Parents, and Your Children. The thing I love about these two books is that every time I have made a recommendation to a client to pick up these books on childhood emotional neglect, they have landed so incredibly well. Dr. Jonice Webb talks about childhood emotional neglect as an invisible factor from childhood that continues to impact you as an adult today. Jonice, thank you so much for joining me. We've talked before, and I'm really delighted to have you back with us. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we've got that hour. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And really, because it's been a few years since we've had a conversation, what's been happening in the years since you've really kind of come up with this concept of childhood emotional neglect, which originally your book was published, the first one in 2012 and the next one in 2018, and they are great companion books for people.
Well, thank you. Yeah, a lot's actually been happening since 2012 when when Running on Empty first came out. The topic of emotional neglect really wasn't being discussed. It's not like the term didn't exist, but people didn't really think of it. Even mental health professionals and researchers were not thinking of it in terms of a separate entity, separate from like childhood emotional abuse or even other varieties of child abuse. They were, anytime you saw the term emotional neglect, it was childhood emotional abuse and neglect. So it was always just kind of tacked on. So my goal was to call attention to the neglect part, and the fact that it's emotional neglect means that that it's even more difficult to see and more difficult to talk about. And since Running on Empty came out, really the topic has exploded. And there are now many different people looking at it, talking about it, treating it. I've trained over 800 therapists to treat emotional neglect all over the world. And Running on Empty's been translated into 12 different languages, and is available in 12 different countries. There's a lot of interest, and I feel like then when Running on Empty No More came out in 2018, I just took the concept further from healing your own emotional neglect to healing the effects, how it's affected your marriage, your parents, your children, because it just kind of has tentacles that once it happens to you as a child, it just takes over different areas of your life that are very important.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I've often thought about childhood emotional neglect like starving to death, because there's so few ways that you can kind of feed that need without really dealing with what it means to lean toward your own need. And that's a healthy need, I think, to have that depth of emotional connection addressed. And yet, if you haven't had it, sometimes we don't know how to get it, and we can just feel this hunger. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think if you haven't had enough emotional attention and validation as a child, you kind of get used to that, and you don't even realize that anything is missing. Intellectually, you don't realize it, but on some level, you just feel that something is missing inside of you. And that's why both of my books are called Running on Empty, because it's that feeling like something is missing inside of me that other people seem to have. And yeah, you might kind of be aware of something, but you don't know what it is.
So how did you really kind of come up with this term, childhood emotional neglect? What does it really mean, this thing that you identify as silent damage?
Yeah, it's really the way I like to differentiate it is to say that it's not what happened to you as a child. It's what failed to happen for you as a child. So it's what your parents didn't say. It's what your parents didn't do. They didn't ask you enough questions. They didn't notice what you were feeling and let you know that that was okay and that they understood. They didn't help you learn what feelings are or how to name them or how to manage them. And oftentimes these are good, caring parents who fail their children this way. It's not that they don't love their child or that they don't want to do the best they can for their child, but they were raised the same way. Their parents didn't teach them these things about emotion either. So their blind spot gets just automatically transferred down to the child.
Mm-hmm. And that is a very tough place to come from, because, well, if somebody said to their parent, oh, I need more about this, I'm not getting enough of that. If the parent doesn't understand how to really deliver that, if they are not nourished themselves, it becomes a bit of a bitter cycle.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of like if you've never tasted pizza, you don't crave pizza. You might crave something substantial that's missing, but you don't know what you're not missing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, for sure. And can you give us a sense of what the components of childhood emotional neglect are? Like what would the warning signs be that somebody grew up in a home where they weren't sufficiently nourished, and now these are the things that are the warning signs?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of them is that sort of empty-ish feeling that I was just describing, that feeling that something is missing. And some people actually feel it in their body, like something is missing, like an emptiness in their belly or their chest or their throat. And for other people, it's more like a feeling that other people have something that they don't have, or a sort of a numbness. Mm-hmm. Also, another sign that you grew up with emotional neglect is if you find emotions kind of baffling and maybe avoid dealing with emotional things. Because if you grew up in a family that, number one, found emotions baffling and avoided them, then that's kind of it's all you could learn about how to deal with this powerful force inside your emotions. And so that's another sign. Some people would call that like low emotional intelligence, meaning just kind of not a great understanding of how emotions work, what they're for, what they are, how to identify them, how to put them into words. So that would be another sign. Not knowing yourself very well is another indication, because if your parents don't really see you emotionally and get you emotionally, they're not able to feed back to you who you truly are on a deep emotional level. And if you don't get that from your parents growing up, you don't really end up knowing yourself very well. You don't necessarily have that information about who you are as a person, what you're good at, what you tend to feel in different situations. If you don't see all of that reflected from your parents, then you tend to not really know yourself or understand yourself very well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that creates another layer of loneliness, because, when we're good with, spending time on our own and enjoying our own company, whatever it is that we're doing, it can actually be very rewarding. But if we are really kind of lonely, even when we're with ourselves, or we don't know what we want, that would certainly make life feel pretty bad. I'm wondering how this, from your perspective, translates into the childhood emotional neglect questionnaire that you created. What kinds of elements are you capturing there?
Yeah, well, interestingly, that questionnaire has not a lot of questions that correlate with what I'm talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, well, basically, what I was trying to do is help people reflect on themselves now in their current lives and come up with, and come up with a sense that they really identify with these questions that they're answering, versus asking a bunch of questions about specific experiences that you had as a child, because people don't remember what failed to happen for them. They do remember how they felt yesterday. But some of these things that I'm talking about are really hard for people to identify in themselves, and they just assume that everybody feels the way they do, that this is just normal, right? If you feel empty, you might assume everyone feels this way and not really question whether there's anything wrong with it.
So then how did you kind of arrive at the realization that childhood emotional neglect was having such a devastating impact on the clients that you were working with? Because you're a trained clinician, you've been working with clients, and something about having a long-term practice informs the clinician about certain patterns and themes. So what was going on clinically that you were seeing this come to the surface?
Well, I think it was because I'd worked in so many different settings. I've worked with people with major mental illnesses. I've worked in psychiatric emergency room. I've worked in substance abuse programs and in in various clinics. And then I opened my own private practice and started working with more worried well type people. And then I realized that the same pattern I had seen in all of these settings kept reappearing and reappearing and reappearing. And it made me question, what is causing people to feel this way? And it was when I was really taking a look at that and trying to figure out, did they all grow up with trauma? No. Did they all grow up, financially deprived? No. Did they all experience abuse? No. And just gradually, I realized that it was a product of what they all didn't get as children, that emotional validation.
So if we were going to peel it back a little bit further, looking at the parents, you've got in your 2018 book, Running on Empty No More, one of the most interesting conceptualizations of what you've identified as emotionally neglectful parents and how to identify them. And I think this is why, I really encourage people to get both books. Like, get both books, because there's something interesting that does happen when you look at both of the books. Because in book number 1, you identify quite a few different kinds of parents. I think there's either 12 or 18 different kinds of parents. And by the time you get to book number 2, you've done this really interesting pulling together of 3 core types from the original, I don't know what it was, 10 or 11, something like that. Mm-hmm. And in the second book, page 72, you write, there are 3 types of emotionally neglectful parents. One type is well-meaning but neglected themselves, and that includes permissive, workaholic, achievement, perfectionistic. Type 2 is parents who are struggling. They may have, it might be a special needs family member, or an issue of bereavement, divorce, or widowing, and struggles with the child as parent, and depression. So personal mental health issues. And then type 3 is self-involved parents, narcissistic, authoritarian, addicted, or sociopathic. And it is so interesting to really look at how each of these parenting types evolve. And the part that I find really kind of crucial is the list that you identified as, things to look for. So I think for the listeners that we've got here today, what I would look at is if you've had a well-meaning parent who themselves are injured, you would look for a whole list of things like, you have the love, but you're surprised by sudden anger, or you feel confused about loving your parents, or you feel guilty when you're angry with them. Like, there's these fabulous kind of lists that help us to understand, was my parent either well-meaning, but, struggling themselves, a struggling parent, or a self-involved parent? And, looking at those things and actually asking yourself, like, what was missing with the relationship that I had with my parents? And I do this, when I'm working with somebody I think is got this kind of background. When I just go through those lists with them, most of them are blown away by what they recognize as features that were common in their relationship with their parent. And, I wonder if you have kind of some examples of, how those relationships might play out, whether it's, type 1, 2, or 3, as somebody goes from their childhood into their adult relationships. What kinds of things do you see?
And their relationships with their parents?
So they have their relationship with their parents, whether it's type 1, 2, or 3. How does that then, be carried into their adult relationships as they age?
Well, let's start with the third category, because I think it's the most obvious one. If your parents are self-involved, in the self-involved category, these are the parents that you mentioned that are either narcissistic or sociopathic. Some addicted parents fall into this. Some authoritarian parents fall into this. So parents who really are just so involved with themselves and their own needs that they don't have even the room or the bandwidth to notice what their child is feeling or experiencing or going through. And so if you grow up with parents like this, you'll have the signs of emotional neglect inside of you, but you also might remember that there was abuse that happened, whether it's emotional or physical. You might be somewhat traumatized by some of the things that you experienced at the hands of your parents. And when that's the case, the one saving grace of having parents like that is that you at least are able to look back and say, look, there are some really severe things that happened to me as a kid. I was severely neglected, or I was abused, or whatever it is. And it can help you take on less responsibility for your adult struggles, meaning feeling less guilt or less defective, because there's an explanation for it, right? You can see, oh, my childhood was kind of not great. It was bad childhood. But if you had struggling parents who were, either depressed, taking care of a sick family member or a needy family member, whether it's a sibling or a parent, or a parent who's struggling financially and working several jobs, that parent might be very devoted in terms of loving you and working really hard and trying their best, but still just failing you emotionally. And so children of struggling parents tend to grow up again with the signs of emotional neglect, but also a burden of guilt, because they look back and they see, oh, my parents were really there, working hard, trying hard. They had all these challenges in life, yet they still did all these things for me. It's much harder, number one, to see the emotional neglect, but also to accept it, because you did have parents who tried. And that same pattern applies to the well-meaning but neglected themselves, which are parents who really love you, believe they're doing everything right, and are trying very hard to do everything right. But, we just talked about them. They have that blind spot because they were raised by parents who had the blind spot. And so if you have parents like that, you're going to have a very hard time seeing the emotional neglect and not blaming it on yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, the differentiation. I like the fact that you started with type number 3 first, and how the burden on the child might be a little bit less. Doesn't mean that you weren't terribly injured, but the burden of kind of taking responsibility for the parent's bad behavior is less of a problem. They don't feel they are clear that their parents were injurious, whereas in the type 1 and 2, they can kind of get that their parents wanted to love them, but the situation was so far from perfect, or they didn't have the skills. Something was keeping them from being the parent that they needed to care for them. So they might take on the guilt or the shame of not having a good relationship, when in fact it was unfortunate, circumstantial, situational. Definitely makes it a bit more burdensome for the child and harder to see.
Yeah, and if you have either well-meaning or struggling parents, you're more prone to having anger at them that you don't understand, and feeling guilty about that too, because it does make people feel angry when they feel deep down that their parents just don't, number one, don't get them, don't understand them, don't see them, and that just feels bad.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On your blog, so I'm just going to say to our wonderful listeners, Dr. Jonice has a great website with wonderful articles posted to it. And one of the blogs is called Raised to Have No Emotional Needs. And I thought that was a great title. And I have seen it because, in my clinic, I work so often with individuals who have experienced significant trauma. And I want to just say that in many cases, when somebody's experienced a noteworthy traumatic event, especially a type 1 event, which is one experience of trauma that is not complicated by a series of chronic events or the element of having a human relationship that has become exceedingly traumatic. Those things tend to be type 2 more complex traumas. But if you have this type 1 trauma and you have an incredibly warm and supportive family life, parents who are really there for you, a family network, friendship network that feels very wholesome. Getting over even very significant trauma is much more readily achieved when you have this steady, wholesome, emotionally loving and secure set of connections.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have these elements in your history where you were not nourished fully. And so the skills that I think you have to share, Jonice, are so incredibly important, because it's almost like you're doing catch up as an adult and you realize, okay, you didn't have it. So you're going to have to find a way to gain these skills you never had in order to create that steady base for yourself. So can you tell us a little bit about this blog, Raised to Have No Emotional Needs, Raised to Ignore, Hide, or Be Ashamed of your own emotions, maybe even rejecting your own or maybe other people's emotions, and why that's a really important skill to develop now that we're starting to talk about it, now that you might be thinking about it as our listeners today.
Yeah. Well, parents can literally raise their children to basically wall off their emotions, but also that walls off their emotional needs. If you're a child and you go to your parents upset about something and they just approach it very practically, or they send you away, or they're clearly made uncomfortable or angry or upset by how you're feeling, the message that the child takes away is, this is too much. I'm too much. My feelings are a negative. I need to hide them. I need to not be looking for help with them, because that's obviously not good. And I'm going to be rejected and disappointed if I do that. So when you learn that as a child, and it's not like your brain is going to probably retain that consciously, but you get wired this way. You're basically wired to not, number one, feel emotions, number two, allow others to see your emotions, and you kind of just learn to hide them from other people, and to not let people know when you need emotional support, to not look for emotional connection when you need it. You just learn not to do those things.
Right. And the very thing that you're hungry for on an unconscious level, that sense of deeper emotional connection and warmth, you're not going to get, because you've learned that it's too risky to show that you need something, or you're having a tougher time, or things are not going as well, or you're feeling sad, or you just want to share in an honest way with somebody that you're developing a relationship with. And the really unfortunate thing is that the more we hide that from the people in our life, the more other people feel like they can't really lean into a relationship with us, because we're not opening up in a warmer way. So they may turn away. You may end up turning away the very people you want to get closer to, because you don't want them to be burdened with your emotions. And I mean, that sounds pretty dangerous. What do you think, Jonice?
Oh, definitely. It's sort of teaching you to be fully self-contained. And then a self-contained person is really hard to be in a relationship with, because they don't need you. They're not comfortable if you need them. And the emotional piece is just kind of blocked off in the relationship, which is why so many marriages between an emotionally neglected person with one who wasn't emotionally neglected, or if two emotionally neglected people marry each other, things can really go awry, because there's just such a big thing that's missing between the two people that's essential for a healthy relationship, which is that emotional vulnerability and emotional connection.
Yeah, that sense that it's okay to be seen. I work with a lot of military, paramilitary, policing individuals in my practice, and it's interesting how that desire to be fully contained can lead to such a sense of not being seen or heard or understood, and how much damage that does, how lonely a person like that can feel. And it's interesting because when a person who has this walled off experience starts to learn how to show more of themselves, there's often this sense of kind of surprise when the relationships around them ripen and warm up and feel more nourishing. And it can be such a lovely thing to watch unfold, but it's quite a big leap to take. Do you have any kind of suggestions for people who have this tendency to basically not want to have any emotional needs, or not want to be seen, to have emotional needs, how to make that leap into warming up their relationships or being seen?
Yeah, I think the very biggest thing for a person who's struggling with this to do is to change how they view emotions. It's really it requires a real sea change inside of oneself to start taking something they've always viewed as a weakness or a shame or something to be hidden, and to start viewing it instead as a strength and a power from within, and something very valuable, because our emotions are an extremely valuable feedback system when we allow ourselves to feel them and listen to them and their messages. Just to change how you view emotions and start seeing them as your helpers and your friends instead of your secret shame.
So talk me through that.
Yeah.
So here you've got somebody who has spent their entire life looking at emotions as a shameful thing, that, if they show somebody their emotions, they'll be rejected. Like, how do you even get to the place where, you're showing even a little bit of it, or allowing yourself to even peel back some of that kind of tough exterior, and let this be seen, or be more accepting of the powerful emotions you're feeling, and instead describe them within inside of yourself as strength and power, not weakness and shame?
Yeah. Well, there's one very practical thing that people can do, which is what I suggested in Running on Empty, which was, it's called the identifying and naming exercise, where the whole sea change happens. It starts from within yourself and how you treat your own emotions. And so if you just sit down for 5 minutes every day alone, close your eyes, turn your attention inward, and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And try to tune into your body and keep your focus on your body, because all feelings happen inside the body. And try to locate anything that could be a feeling, and then try to name what that feeling might be. And at first, it might feel very foreign and impossible, and you might come up, I don't feel anything. I've done this in my office with so many emotionally neglected people, and the first thing they usually say is, nothing, I got nothing. Mm-hmm. But the key is to just keep doing it, because every time you do it, you're reaching out to your blocked emotions. It's like you putting out your hand and saying, here I am, I'm ready now. Come on. And they don't like rush in, and you won't be overwhelmed, and you won't end up in a psychiatric hospital. A lot of people have said, I can't let myself feel, I'll end up in a hospital. Well, I've never seen it happen a single time, because it doesn't work that way. It's basically you're just chipping a little bit out of that wall that's blocking them. And if you keep doing it and doing it, you will start getting inklings of feeling, and you'll start trying to put words to that feeling. And every feeling has a message that your body, it's carrying a message from your body. It might be telling you, watch out for something, take care of yourself better, speak up for yourself on this, protect yourself from this person, you need to change your job. Feelings carry all kinds of really valuable guiding messages that are true to our deepest inner selves. And when we listen, they give us great, great power, energy, motivation, guidance. They carry it all.
It is powerful. And it's like, I'm hearing what you're saying, and it really kind of equates to me as I listen that your emotions are part of your inner wisdom system, if you will use it in that way.
Definitely.
And it sounds like the really lovely instruction sounds like, just allow yourself to be curious rather than immediately judgmental toward the emotions that are surfacing. And when you start to see somebody doing that, this potential for a real deep read on themselves could definitely move them in a different kind of relationship. What do you see with that when people start to kind of really confront their blocked emotions, or really be more warmly connected toward their own emotions? What do you see in terms of how their relationships change?
Boy, that is a great question. It's my favorite thing to experience as a therapist, and also to talk about, because it's quite remarkable. And you just alluded to it yourself when you were talking about the military families. So you've seen this, that because I work with a lot of couples, like I said, where one or both members of the couple has childhood emotional neglect. And when that opening happens, it's, like I said, it's gradual. But even if it's negative emotion, even if the blocked person, the CEN person, starts to share more complaints or more, requirements that they weren't voicing before, I have never seen a partner become put off by that. In fact, it draws the partner closer, and the relationship just kind of becomes deeper and warmer, because the two people are able to finally know each other better on a deeper level. And that has incredible value and power in a relationship. So it really is like a warming up and a connecting and a getting closer that makes the relationship a lot stronger.
It's a beautiful thing to hear, that with all the experience that you have with couples who've gone through, warming up their relationships, that people don't turn away. In fact, they are able to develop the skills to hear and understand and connect to, the needs and concerns of their partner. What happens when you have two people, both who have childhood emotional neglect, one who's really ready to do the work, but the other really is frightened of it?
Yeah. Well, then it becomes, sometimes, the ready partner can help along the less ready partner, but not always. And it can be very, very frustrating. And some marriages can even end over that. It is partly a matter of timing, and people are only ready to accept this, and people are only ready to, willing to see it when they're ready. And so if one partner is ready way sooner than the other, it can be a real serious problem. But oftentimes, when the less ready partner sees the ready partner doing a lot of work and changing for the better, it's an inspiration. And so what I usually tell people in that situation, that I tell the ready partner, what I usually say is, just do your own work, keep growing, keep healing, keep getting more and more comfortable with your own feelings, and focus on yourself and your own healing. And your partner will either be inspired by that, or you're going to leave your partner behind. But we don't know what's going to happen yet. So just do that, and we'll make a decision, when you're ready.
Right. Because it would be particularly lonely if you are starting to do your own inner work and recognizing what your needs are, only to find yourself in a relationship with somebody who's really not prepared to do that work. Do you find that some people shut themselves back down because they don't want to risk losing the relationship?
Yes.
Okay, can you just talk a little bit about that and how that might look, or what people might want to consider doing?
Yeah, and I also want to mention another thing that can happen, which is if you're an emotionally neglected person married to a self-involved person, potentially like a narcissistic type of person, narcissistic partners do not want their emotionally neglected partner to start speaking up and having feelings, because they want all the space for themselves. And so that can cause trouble in a marriage as well. So some people experience that, and I just want to mention that.
That is such a good point, because I think what could happen easily enough is that, an individual married to somebody with narcissistic personality or something in that range, that they may then start to encounter the real fault line of the marriage itself, because it was working okay up until the point that they started to do their own exploration. As soon as they start doing their exploration, there's a realization that this marriage cannot continue as it is. You can only imagine what a great partner a childhood emotionally neglected person would be for a narcissist. Can you?
Oh, they go together like a hand in glove.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
When you're someone who's emotionally neglected, you tend to take up little space because your emotions are hidden, right? And you don't feel comfortable asking for things because you learn not to do that as a child. And so you take up little space, whereas a narcissistic person takes up a lot of space, right? It's all about me. I have the limelight. I want the limelight. I want the attention. I have all the needs. So they really just kind of can attract each other.
Yeah, it's almost like the person who struggles with childhood emotional neglect might actually in some ways really gravitate towards somebody who's narcissistic, because it is a way of not doing your work when you're actually in a relationship with somebody, as you said, who takes up all the space, who has all the needs, who needs to have a tremendous amount of supply that you're providing. You don't really have to stop and really do your own reflection and get to know yourself. I mean, in a way, that's a really powerful game changer, to really do that inner work. I mean, sometimes we will deliberately, seek out people in life who will distract us from the work that we need to do ourselves. And it's easy to understand why a person will want to do it. I mean, the reality is it's hard work. Like this thing that you're talking about, finding out who you are, really figuring that out, really coming to terms with the strength of your emotion, having a relationship with your emotion, being curious about it. This is not for the faint of heart.
Right. It's really not. And also, if you're an emotionally neglected person who had a self-involved parent, then it feels very comfortable to be with a self-involved partner. And it also feels normal. And it feels like what you learned love is supposed to be, because we all learn what love is from our parents' love. So if that's the kind of love that you experienced as a child, then you're going to mistake that for love as an adult. And I think that happens to a lot of CEN people as well.
You write about the signs and signals of unrealistic self-appraisal, and I was particularly interested in how that plays out, and the fact that people can grow up in a certain kind of home and then really either have an inaccurate sense of who they are, or really a disconnection to what their true gifts and needs are as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that playing out, and how dangerous that really is?
Yes, I think it's dangerous in a lot of different areas, because I was talking a little bit earlier about not seeing yourself reflected in your parents' eyes. so that you don't really have a deep sense of who you are as a person, your strengths and weaknesses, what you like and don't like, what you want and don't want. And when you're not sure about those things within yourself, you become too vulnerable to following what other people say about you. Like, I've seen emotionally neglected people. Sorry, I have some noise here in the background.
It's okay. I don't hear it.
Okay, good. Um, some emotionally neglected people, instead of making their own decisions, will ask, five of their friends, take a poll: should I take this job or not? Should I switch my career or not? And put so much weight into what other people say that they end up just following a path, or they just take a job because it's offered, without really because they don't have that inner emotional self that they can consult, that gut self that will tell them this is for me or not for me. And that can apply to a spouse, a job, a career, a decision about whether to have children, a decision about where to live. Like, some of the biggest decisions in life, we really have to be able to consult what we know about ourselves on a deep level in order to make the right decision. And if you don't have that inner guide, you end up kind of going wherever the wind blows you, or wherever people send you.
You wrote about this client, Josh, who was underemployed and working as a truck driver, delivery person for a construction company, and that he really didn't feel like he belonged there. He found the job wasn't a good fit. It was tiring, it was boring, and that he had tried to teach high school English because he'd had his master's, and he just ended up giving up when parents and school administrators told him that he didn't have enough control over the classroom. But it led to him having this experience of sensing he was not capable of choosing or committing to a career, or even figuring out what he was interested in. And there was this interesting relationship that he had with his mother, that he didn't really feel seen and heard or understood. It's that kind of mirroring piece that you were talking about before, having a parent who could look at you and really say, hey, yeah, I see you really love art, and look at what you're doing here, like you really love mixing colors together, or whatever it is. Doesn't matter what the story is, but it's like you've got none of that mirroring. So when you go out into the world, you can't really figure out how you're landing, and you don't look kind of steady in the decisions that you make. So this is this kind of unrealistic self-appraisal kind of playing out. This guy was really lonely. How did you get him moving forward?
Well, you brought up a really important point about Josh, which is that if you don't know yourself well, you're a lot less resilient. Because for him, because he was getting criticism, he just ran into a rough spot in his chosen career. And that rough spot was enough to knock him completely out of the game, because he wasn't able to say to himself, gee, they're saying I don't have enough control over the classroom. Maybe that's because I didn't have structure when I was a kid, and I'm having trouble structuring kids now. Maybe it's because I didn't learn how to do that as a child. And maybe that's a weak spot for me. But however, at least I know I'm really intelligent, and I can rely on my intelligence to help me learn that new skill. So that's an idea of when you're resilient, when you know yourself well, you're more resilient, because you can take a flaw and correct it using what you know are your strengths. But if you don't know yourself well, one chink and you're out. You're much easier to break. So for Josh, it was a matter of helping him get in much better touch with himself and his own feelings, and start paying attention to who he really was, his strengths and weaknesses, his preferences, what he was good at, what he struggled with, what he wanted for himself. And most of those answers were in his feelings, like looking to his feelings for those answers, like deep into his own self versus just answering from his mind or what other people said.
And, it's a really good example because you keep on going back to, looking into his own feelings for those answers. And yet, when we have this struggle with childhood emotional neglect and we haven't yet gotten to that place, we can find ourselves in the world forming relationships that actually interfere in our connection with ourself and our emotion. And I was really struck with, you came up with a list of how childhood emotional neglect affects your choice of partner. But I almost think, from many of the conversations I've had, it seems like it's not just your partners, but the people you gravitate in your friendships, the people you sit with, or you go to lunch with at work, the people that you connect with on the weekends or in the evenings, or maybe you're not doing that at all. But, the issue is that it can really interfere in you actually finding those layers of emotions. I'm going to read the 5 things that you came up with because I think they will be of great interest to our listeners. But from my perspective, it seems like it's not just the partnership, but it's also friendships, people that you seem to connect with. Does that sound right to you, Jonice? Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Okay, these are the 5 things. Seeking out the same neglect you got from your own parents because it's familiar. That's 1. 2, seeking out and you have an intense need to fill your emptiness, so you commit too soon. The next one, not truly committing so that no one really sees you in your truest sense, your needs and your feelings. So, you're kind of still alone. Marrying someone with intense emotions to compensate for your bland world. And we talked about this one already, marrying a narcissist because you take up such little space and you attract someone who could take up a lot. So I'm just saying this for the listeners out there. If you think you've got CEN and you're thinking about, why am I so lonely in my life still, and I'm trying to do this work, start to think about the kind of connections that you have. They may be getting in the way. And then finally, the other piece that I'm thinking about is, and this is, based on some of the things that you've discussed in your book, boundaries. So can we talk about boundaries and how important they are?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, boundaries are really the thing that protects us and helps us walk around in the world knowing that not only are we safe, emotionally safe from other people, but other people are emotionally safe from us. So I like to think of people as having two boundaries, one which guards us from what happens outside, what other people throw at us, and one that protects other people from what we might want to throw at them. And so it really is, boundaries are all about how we want to be treated and what's acceptable to us about how others treat us, and also about how we want to treat others. Mm-hmm. Anything else you wanted to hear about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think it's such an interesting issue, especially when, somebody's starting to really look at their own emotions and they've got somebody who basically doesn't want them to look at their own emotions because it changes the dynamic in the relationship. Boundaries are really important. Jonice, we're going to close our conversation today, but I just wanted to ask you, is there anything else that you wanted our listeners to think about, or any other practices or suggestions that you have for those who are joining us?
I would suggest, if anyone is listening to this who feels that this could be what's happening in their life, you can go to emotionalneglect.com and take the emotional neglect test, which will help you figure out if this could indeed be going on in your life. And you can also learn a lot more about emotional neglect and how it happens and how it affects all areas of your life. And I also have some online childhood emotional neglect recovery programs for various areas of your life. And there's a lot of resources there, lots of free resources.
There are a lot of free resources on your site. It was really a delight to speak with you today, Jonice. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to reinforce that, these two books are pretty remarkable, Running on Empty and Running on Empty No More. And I would really encourage people that if they think that this conversation resonates with them and they're seeing themselves, that they maybe pick up the books, read them through, or go to the website and make use of some of those amazing resources. And I want to thank you again, Jonice, for joining us. And I hope you have a great day. And I want to say goodbye to all our listeners again, and we will see you again. Please take care of yourself, be gentle with yourself, and kind of lean in and do some of that emotional work. Looking forward to speaking with you all again next month. Be well.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.